The sound of heavy machinery at 6 a.m. wasn't exactly what I expected to wake up to on a Tuesday morning, especially when it was parked in my backyard with a demolition crew preparing to tear down the shed I'd spent 3 months building with my own hands. Karen Whitfield stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, clipboard in hand, directing the workers like some kind of suburban general commanding her troops. She spotted me stumbling out of my pajamas and gave me that sickeningly sweet smile that I'd learned to recognize as pure venom. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out cheerfully, as if orchestrating the destruction of my property was just another pleasant neighborhood activity. "Don't worry, we'll have this eyesore cleaned up before lunch. The new uniformity standards require all structures to complement the community's modern aesthetic." That's when I realized this wasn't just about my shed. This was about Karen's obsession with control, and she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. Little did she know, I'd been quietly researching property lines and zoning laws for months, and what I'd discovered was about to turn her perfect little world upside down. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The whole nightmare began 6 months earlier when I moved to Willowbrook Estates, a supposedly quiet suburban community that promised the perfect balance of privacy and community spirit. After my divorce finalized and I found myself starting over at 42, I'd used most of my savings to buy a modest 3-bedroom house on what I thought was a peaceful cul-de-sac. The realtor, Jennifer, had been enthusiastic about the neighborhood's amenities and the active homeowners association that maintains property values. What she failed to mention was that the HOA president, Karen Whitfield, treated the community like her personal kingdom and every resident like a subject who needed constant supervision. Karen lived in the largest house on the block, a sprawling contemporary monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about successful suburban families. Her husband, David, was some kind of corporate executive who traveled constantly, leaving Karen with unlimited time to focus on her true passion, which was making everyone else's life miserable in the name of community standards. She had perfectly manicured everything, from her lawn that looked like it was trimmed with scissors, to her white Mercedes SUV that never seemed to have a speck of dust on it. Karen was the type of person who measured her neighbor's grass height and left passive-aggressive notes about holiday decorations being removed exactly 24 hours after the holiday ended. My first encounter with Karen happened during my second week in the neighborhood. I'd been unpacking boxes in my garage when she appeared at the end of my driveway, dressed in what I would later learn was her standard uniform of expensive athleisure wear and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcomed me to the community with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. Then she handed me a thick packet of papers titled Willowbrook Estates Community Standards and Regulations, Revised Edition, which looked more comprehensive than the tax code. "Just some light reading to help you understand our community values," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a cohesive aesthetic that protects everyone's property values. I'm sure you'll find everything perfectly reasonable." As she walked away, I flipped through the packet and realized I'd stumbled into a neighborhood governed by someone who had clearly never heard the phrase, "live and let live." The document contained detailed specifications for everything from the exact shade of white, acceptable for house trim, to the maximum height of garden gnomes, which were apparently limited to 8 inches, and required written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The regulations were so specific, they bordered on the absurd. Section 12 detailed the approved color palette for exterior paint, which consisted of exactly 7 shades of beige and gray. Section 18 outlined the acceptable dimensions for outdoor furniture, including a subsection about the proper way to store pool noodles. Section 23 covered landscaping requirements, including a mandate that all grass be maintained at a height between 2 and 3 inches, with weekly measurements being conducted by volunteer community ambassadors. The final section, which I initially skimmed over, dealt with outbuildings and additional structures, requiring approval from the Architectural Review Committee for anything larger than a mailbox. For the first few months, I tried to fly under Karen's radar while I settled into my new life. I kept my lawn perfectly trimmed, painted my front door an approved shade of morning mist gray, and even attended a few community meetings where Karen held court like a suburban monarch. The meetings were surreal experiences, where grown adults debated the merits of different mailbox styles and whether artificial flowers violated the natural beauty clause of the community standards. Karen ran these meetings with the efficiency of a military operation, complete with PowerPoint presentations about maintaining our community's prestigious reputation. The trouble started when I decided to build a shed in my backyard. After months of apartment living during the divorce proceedings, I'd accumulated a collection of tools, sports equipment, and household items that didn't fit in my new house's limited storage space. A simple shed seemed like the perfect solution, and I'd always enjoyed working with my hands. Building something from scratch felt like the kind of therapeutic project I needed to help me move forward with my life. I spent weeks researching designs and materials, finally settling on a classic barn-style shed that would complement my house's traditional architecture. The plan called for a 12 by 16 structure with cedar siding, a metal roof, and double doors that would provide easy access for my lawnmower and other equipment. I applied for the necessary building permits with the county, had the utility companies mark the underground lines, and even hired a surveyor to ensure I was staying well within my property boundaries. The construction process became my weekend obsession. I'd wake up early on Saturdays and spend the entire day measuring, cutting, and assembling. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the structure take shape, board by board, nail by nail. My next-door neighbor, Bill, an elderly retired carpenter, often wandered over to offer advice and share stories about the projects he'd built over the years. He complimented my work and mentioned that it was refreshing to see someone taking pride in doing things the right way. By the time I finished the shed 3 months later, I was genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. The cedar siding had weathered to a beautiful silver-gray color, the metal roof provided clean lines that echoed the house's architecture, and the whole structure felt solid and permanent. I'd even installed a small window on the side facing my house, which let in natural light and gave the shed a more finished appearance. The final touch was a hand-carved sign that read, "Marcus's Workshop," which I mounted above the double doors. That's when Karen struck. I should have seen it coming. During the construction process, I'd noticed her walking past my backyard more frequently than seemed normal, always carrying her phone and taking what looked like photos. She'd also started appearing at her kitchen window whenever I was working on the shed, watching my progress with the intensity of someone conducting surveillance. When I waved at her, she'd quickly disappear behind her curtains, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. The first official complaint came in the form of a certified letter from the HOA, delivered on a Monday morning exactly 1 week after I'd finished the shed. The letter, written in formal legal language that probably cost more to produce than my entire shed, informed me that my unauthorized structure was in violation of multiple community standards and needed to be removed within 30 days. According to the letter, my shed violated regulations regarding architectural consistency, color coordination, and the approval process for outbuildings. I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how a well-built shed on my own property could possibly violate anyone's standards. The accusations were specific, but seemed completely arbitrary. The shed was supposedly inconsistent with the community's modern aesthetic vision, the natural cedar color was not within the approved palette, and the barn-style design was incompatible with contemporary SAS architectural standards. Most importantly, the letter emphasized that I had failed to obtain approval from the Architectural Review Committee before beginning construction. My first instinct was to call Karen directly and try to resolve the situation through a reasonable conversation. I'd seen her garden in the evenings, so I walked over to her house that Tuesday around 6 o'clock, hoping to catch her in a moment when she might be more approachable. I found her watering her roses, which were arranged in perfect rows that looked like they'd been planted with a ruler and measuring tape. "Hi, Karen," I said, holding up the letter. "I was hoping we could talk about this shed situation. I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding." She looked up from her roses with that same fake smile, but her eyes had a hardness that I hadn't noticed before. "Oh, Marcus, there's no misunderstanding at all. The community standards are very clear about the approval process for outbuildings. You should have submitted your plans to the Architectural Review Committee before you started construction. I explained that I'd obtained all the necessary permits from the county and had been careful to follow all the local building codes. I mentioned that I'd had a surveyor confirm the property boundaries and that the shed was entirely within my own land. Karen listened with the patience of someone who was waiting for me to finish talking so she can explain why I was wrong. County permits are one thing, she said, turning back to her roses. But community standards are what maintain our property values and preserve the character of our neighborhood. Your shed might be legal, but it's not appropriate for Willowbrook Estates. The Architectural Review Committee exists to ensure that all structures complement our community's vision. I asked if there was any way to modify the shed to bring it into compliance with the community standards. Maybe I could paint it a different color or add some architectural elements that would make it more acceptable. Karen considered this for a moment, then shook her head. I'm afraid the fundamental design is incompatible with our aesthetic goals. The barn-style architecture simply doesn't fit with our modern community vision. The only solution is removal and replacement with cushion, something more appropriate. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Karen maintaining her position that the shed had to go, regardless of how much time and money I'd invested in building it. She suggested that I could apply to the Architectural Review Committee for approval to build a new shed that would meet community standards, which would involve submitting detailed plans and paying a $500 RAL. Review, FI. Even if the committee approved my new plans, I would still need to remove the existing shed at my own expense. As I walked back to my house, I felt a familiar frustration building in my chest. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that had made my divorce so miserable. Dealing with people who used rules and regulations as weapons to control other people's lives. Karen wasn't interested in community standards or property values. She was interested in demonstrating that she had the power to make me tear down something I'd worked hard to build. That night, I decided to do some research. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, I was going to make sure I understood exactly what those rules were. I pulled out the community standards packet and read through it carefully, paying special attention to the sections about outbuildings and the Architectural Review Committee. What I discovered was interesting. The regulations were detailed and specific, but they were also full of loopholes and inconsistencies. The Architectural Review Committee consisted of 3 members, Karen, her next-door neighbor Sandra, and a rotating third member who was supposed to be elected annually. According to the bylaws, the committee could only make decisions when all 3 members were present, and any decision could be appealed to the full HOA membership. More importantly, the regulations only applied to properties within the official HOA boundaries, which were defined by a legal description that referenced specific survey markers and property lines. This got me thinking about something the surveyor had mentioned during my shed construction. When he'd marked my property boundaries, he'd made a comment about how my lot was right at the edge of the development, and that the original subdivision had some interesting quirks in how the boundaries were drawn. I'd been focused on the shed construction at the time and hadn't paid much attention to his comment, but now I wondered if there might be more to it. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent the day in the records office, researching property deeds, subdivision maps, and zoning regulations. What I discovered was fascinating. Willowbrook Estates had been developed in 2 phases, with the original subdivision being completed in 2008 and an additional section being added in 2012. My house was part of the second phase, but due to some complicated zoning issues related to wetlands and utility easements, several lots in the second phase were technically outside the legal boundaries of the BT's original HOA. The surveyor's records confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. My property, along with 3 other houses on my street, was located in a zone that had been designated as transitional residential, rather than being included in the planned community zone that governed the rest of Willowbrook Estates. This meant that while I'd been paying HOA fees and receiving all the community benefits, my property was not actually subject to the HOA's architectural standards. Armed with this information, I called Karen and requested a meeting with the Architectural Review Committee. I wanted to present my findings in a formal setting where there would be witnesses to the conversation. Karen seemed surprised by my request, but agreed to schedule a meeting for the following Saturday morning at her house. The meeting took place in Karen's living room, which was decorated with the same sterile perfection as the rest of her house. Everything was white or beige, arranged in perfect symmetry, and looked like it had never been used for anything as messy as actual living. Karen sat behind a glass coffee table with Sandra beside her, while the third committee member, a nervous-looking man named Robert, sat slightly apart from the group. I presented my research methodically, starting with the subdivision maps and working through the zoning regulations and property descriptions. I explained how my house was technically outside the HOA boundaries and therefore not subject to the Architectural Review Committee's jurisdiction. Karen listened with growing irritation, occasionally interrupting to argue about the interpretation of various legal documents. "This is all very interesting," Karen said when I finished my presentation. "But you're missing the point. You moved into this community and agreed to abide by our standards. The legal technicalities don't change your moral obligation to respect the community's values." Sandra nodded vigorously, while Robert looked increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I pointed out that I'd never actually agreed to abide by the community standards, since my property wasn't legally part of the HOA. I'd been paying the fees because I'd assumed they were required, but now I realized I'd been paying for services that I wasn't legally obligated to receive. Karen's face grew red as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Are you saying you're not going to remove the shed?" she asked, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Because I can assure you that this committee will not tolerate defiance of our community standards." I explained that I was simply saying the committee had no legal authority over my property and therefore couldn't require me to remove anything. The meeting ended with Karen threatening to explore all available options to resolve the situation. As I walked back to my house, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. I'd won the legal argument, but I knew Karen well enough to realize that she wasn't the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. She was going to find another way to make my life difficult. I was right to be concerned. Over the next few weeks, Karen launched a campaign of harassment that was both creative and relentless. She started by filing complaints with the county about my shed, claiming it violated various building codes and safety regulations. When the county inspector came out and confirmed that my shed was properly permitted and built to code, Karen filed additional complaints about landscaping violations and property maintenance issues. None of the complaints were valid, but each one required time and energy to address. I had to take time off work to meet with inspectors, respond to certified letters, and document my compliance with various regulations. Karen seemed to have an endless supply of new complaints, each one more ridiculous than the last. She complained that my shed was too close to the property line, even though the surveyor had confirmed it was well within the required setbacks. She complained that the metal roof created excessive noise during rainstorms, even though metal roofs are quieter than traditional shingles. She even complained that the shed was attracting rodents, despite having no evidence to support this claim. The harassment campaign reached its peak when Karen hired a lawyer to send me a cease and desist letter demanding that I remove the shed or face legal action. The letter was full of legal jargon and implied threats, but when I had my own lawyer review it, he laughed and said it was all bark and no bite. Karen's lawyer had essentially admitted that the HOA had no legal authority over my property, while threatening to sue me for not complying with rules that didn't apply to me. That's when I realized Karen had made a crucial mistake. In her determination to force me to remove my shed, she documented the fact that my property was outside the HOA boundaries. This meant that not only was I not subject to the Architectural Review Committee's authority, but I was also not obligated to pay the HOA fees that had been automatically deducted from my bank account for bureau. The past year, I called the HOA management company and explained the situation. After reviewing the legal documents I'd gathered, they agreed that my property was indeed outside the HOA boundaries and that I was entitled to a refund of all the fees I'd paid. The refund amounted to nearly $3,000, which was more than enough to cover the legal costs I'd incurred defending myself against Karen's harassment campaign. But the real revelation came when I started researching the property boundaries more carefully. The original subdivision maps showed that while my house was outside the HOA boundaries, the boundaries themselves were drawn in an unusual way that created some interesting opportunities. The wetlands and utility easements that had complicated the original development created a buffer zone that was designated for public access, and this buffer zone ran right through the middle of what everyone assumed was CHOA, private property. According to the county records, a portion of Karen's perfectly manicured backyard was actually within the public access buffer zone, which meant it could be used for approved public purposes like nature trails, wildlife observation areas, or recreational facilities. The County Parks Department had been looking for ways to expand public access to the wetlands area, and I realized I might have found the perfect solution. I spent the next few weeks researching the process for establishing a public access point and nature trail. The county was enthusiastic about the idea, especially since it would provide educational opportunities for school groups and nature enthusiasts. The proposed trail would run along the edge of the wetlands, providing access to a beautiful natural area that had been largely hidden from public view. The trail would require some basic facilities, including a small parking area, informational signs, and, most importantly, a restroom facility for visitors. The county preferred composting toilets for environmental reasons, and they were willing to provide funding for the construction and maintenance of the facilities. All I needed to do was identify a suitable location for the restroom that would be convenient for trail users while meeting all the environmental and zoning requirements. That's when I had the idea that would turn Karen's harassment campaign into the biggest mistake of her life. The public access buffer zone ran right through Karen's backyard, passing within 10 feet of her precious shed. The shed, which was identical to mine in every way except for its approved beige color, was perfectly positioned to be converted into a public restroom facility. The county loved the idea, especially since it would save them the cost of building a new structure from scratch. I submitted the proposal to the County Parks Department, along with detailed plans for converting the existing shed into a composting toilet facility. The conversion would involve installing proper ventilation, adding accessible entrances, and creating educational displays about wetlands conservation. The county would handle all the permitting and construction costs, while I would coordinate with the landowner to ensure proper access. Of course, I didn't mention that the landowner was Karen, or that she had no idea what was coming. The county approved the project within 2 weeks, and I received official notification that construction would begin within 30 days. According to the legal documents, property owners within the public access buffer zone were required to allow reasonable public use of their land, and converting an existing structure to serve public needs was considered to be a reasonable use. I waited until the Friday before construction was scheduled to begin, before sending Karen a certified letter informing her of the project. The letter, written in the same formal legal language she'd used to harass me, explained that her property was partially within the public access buffer zone, and that the county would be exercising its right to convert her shed into a public restroom facility to serve nature trail visitors. Karen's response was immediate and explosive. She called me within an hour of receiving the letter, screaming about property rights and threatening to sue everyone involved in the project. I listened calmly as she ranted, then explained that I was simply facilitating a county project that would provide important public services. Just as she had repeatedly told me, sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. "You can't do this," she screamed. "That's my property, my shed. You can't just turn it into a public bathroom." I reminded her that according to the county records, the shed was within the public access buffer zone, and that property owners in that zone were required to allow reasonable public use of their land. I also mentioned that the county had reviewed all the legal documents and confirmed that the project was entirely within their authority. Karen threatened to get a lawyer and stop the project, but I knew she didn't have any legal grounds to challenge the county's authority. The buffer zone designation had been part of the original subdivision approval, and every property owner in the area had been notified of the restrictions when they purchased their homes. Karen had simply never bothered to read the fine print. The construction began the following Monday, and it was even better than I'd hoped. The county brought in a crew of skilled workers who treated the project with the same professionalism they'd use for any public facility. They installed proper ventilation systems, added accessible ramps and doorways, and created beautiful educational displays about wetlands conservation and wildlife protection. The exterior of the shed was painted in earth tones that complemented the natural environment, and the county added attractive landscaping around the facility. A small sign was installed identifying the structure as Willowbrook Wetlands Nature Trail Public Restroom, maintained by County Parks Department. The sign also included information about trail hours, conservation guidelines, and a phone number for reporting any maintenance issues. The transformation was remarkable. Karen's sterile beige shed had been converted into an attractive and functional public facility that actually enhanced the natural beauty of the area. The county had done such a good job that the restroom looked like it had been designed specifically for its location, rather than being a converted storage building. Karen's reaction to the completed project was everything I'd hoped for and more. She stood in her backyard staring at the restroom facility with the expression of someone who'd just watched their house burn down. The realization that dozens of strangers would be using what had been her private storage space seemed to hit her like a physical blow. The nature trail opened to the public on a beautiful Saturday morning in late spring. The county had done an excellent job promoting the new facility, and there was a steady stream of visitors throughout the day. Families with children, elderly couples, serious hikers, and casual walkers all made use of the trail and the restroom facility. The educational displays were popular with school groups, and several teachers mentioned that they planned to bring their classes back for field trips. I spent the morning working in my garden, where I had a perfect view of the activity around the restroom facility. Every time someone emerged from the building, I felt a little surge of satisfaction. Karen had tried to use bureaucratic harassment to force me to tear down my shed, and instead, she'd ended up losing her own shed to a public restroom project. The best part was watching Karen try to maintain her composure when neighbors asked her about the new facility. She'd clearly been hoping that the whole thing would go away if she ignored it, but the steady stream of visitors made that impossible. When Sandra asked her about the restroom during their morning walk, Karen's explanation was painful to watch. "It's a county project," she said through gritted teeth. "They're using part of my property for public access to the wetlands." Sandra seemed impressed by Karen's civic-mindedness, commenting that it was wonderful how Karen was contributing to the community's recreational opportunities. Karen's smile looked like it was causing her physical pain. The situation got even better when the local newspaper ran a story about the new nature trail and its facilities. The article praised the county's innovative approach to wetlands conservation and mentioned the cooperation of local residents in making the project possible. Karen's name was mentioned specifically as the property owner who had graciously allowed the conversion of her existing structure to serve the public good. The article included quotes from several trail users who praised the cleanliness and convenience of the restroom facility. One elderly hiker mentioned that the availability of proper facilities made the trail accessible to people who might not otherwise be able to enjoy the natural area. A teacher from the local elementary school said the restroom made it possible for her to bring her entire class on nature walks without worrying about logistics. Karen's attempt to get revenge took an unexpected turn when she decided to file a complaint with the county about the restroom facility. She claimed that the constant stream of visitors was disrupting her peaceful enjoyment of her property and that the facility was being used for purposes beyond what had been originally approved. The county investigated her complaint thoroughly and issued a formal response that was copied to all the relevant parties. The response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. The county acknowledged Karen's concerns, but explained that the facility was being used exactly as intended and that all activities were within the scope of the original approval. The response also noted that the buffer zone designation had been part of the original subdivision approval and that all property owners had been notified of the potential for public use when they purchased their homes. More importantly, the response included a detailed analysis of visitor usage patterns that showed the facility was actually being used less frequently than originally projected. The county had expected an average of 50 visitors per day, but the actual usage was averaging only 35 visitors per day. This meant that Karen's complaints about excessive usage were not supported by the data. The county's response concluded by noting that the restroom facility was providing an important public service and that the educational displays were contributing to important conservation goals. The response thanked Karen for her continued cooperation with the project and assured her that the county would continue to monitor the facility to ensure it was being used appropriately. Karen's final attempt at revenge was to organize a petition among the neighborhood residents to have the restroom facility removed. She spent several weeks going door to door, explaining how the facility was disrupting the character of the neighborhood and asking people to sign a petition demanding its removal. The results were not what she hoped for. Most of the residents were actually supportive of the nature trail and the restroom facility. Several mentioned that they'd used the trail themselves and found it to be a valuable addition to the community's recreational opportunities. Others said they were proud to live in a neighborhood that contributed to environmental conservation and public access to natural areas. The few residents who were willing to sign Karen's petition were mostly concerned about property values, but even they acknowledged that the facility was well maintained and attractive. When Karen presented her petition to the county commissioners, it contained only 7 signatures out of the 43 households in the immediate area. The county commissioners listened politely to Karen's presentation, but ultimately decided that the restroom facility was serving its intended purpose and should remain in operation. They noted that the facility had received positive feedback from users and that it was contributing to the county's environmental education goals. They also mentioned that removing the facility would require the county to build a new restroom somewhere else, which would be a waste of taxpayer money. As summer turned to fall, the nature trail and its restroom facility became a regular part of the neighborhood's rhythm. Dog walkers used the trail for their morning and evening routes, families brought children to explore the wetlands, and serious hikers appreciated having a convenient starting point for longer wilderness adventures. The facility remained clean and well-maintained, and the educational displays continued to attract school groups and nature enthusiasts. Karen's relationship with the rest of the neighborhood had clearly been damaged by her campaign against the restroom facility. Neighbors who had once respected her leadership of the HOA began to question her judgment and priorities. Several residents mentioned that they appreciated having a nature trail in the neighborhood and couldn't understand why Karen was so opposed to it. The situation reached a turning point when Karen's husband David returned from one of his business trips and learned about the restroom facility. According to neighbors who witnessed the conversation, David was initially confused about why Karen was so upset about what seemed like a reasonable public project. When Karen explained her campaign to have the facility removed, David seemed embarrassed by her behavior and suggested that she might be overreacting to the situation. The conversation apparently continued inside their house, but the raised voices could be heard through the windows. Several neighbors mentioned that they'd never heard Karen and David argue before, and that David seemed genuinely frustrated with Karen's handling of the situation. The argument seemed to focus on Karen's expensive legal fees and the damage to their reputation in the neighborhood. As winter approached, the nature trail saw less frequent use, but the restroom facility remained in operation for the occasional hardy hiker or dog walker. The county had installed a small heater to prevent the plumbing from freezing, and the facility continued to be cleaned and maintained on a regular schedule. Karen had apparently given up her campaign against the facility and was focusing her energy on other HOA matters. My own relationship with Karen had evolved into something resembling a Cold War. We were polite when we encountered each other in the neighborhood, but there was an underlying tension that everyone could sense. She'd clearly learned that I wasn't going to be intimidated by her harassment tactics, and I'd learned that she was capable of remarkable persistence when she set her mind to something. The spring reopening of the nature trail brought renewed activity to the area, and the restroom facility proved its value once again. The county had added some new educational displays over the winter, and the facility was attracting more school groups and organized nature walks. Karen had apparently resigned herself to the permanent presence of the facility and was focusing her efforts on other neighborhood issues. The final twist in the story came when the county announced that the nature trail had been selected for expansion as part of a regional conservation initiative. The expanded trail would connect to other wetlands areas and create a continuous hiking corridor that would attract visitors from across the state. The restroom facility would serve as a key support point for the expanded trail system. The announcement included plans for additional facilities, including a small parking area, informational kiosks, and enhanced landscaping around the restroom facility. The county was clearly committed to the long-term success of the project, and Karen's shed had become a permanent part of the public infrastructure. As I sit in my backyard workshop, looking out at the nature trail and the facility that used to be Karen's shed, I can't help but appreciate the irony of the situation. Karen's determination to force me to tear down my shed had led to her own shed being converted into a public restroom. Her campaign of harassment had backfired spectacularly, and she'd ended up contributing to a project that she'd never wanted to support. The whole experience had taught me some important lessons about standing up to bullies and doing research before accepting other people's claims about rules and regulations. Karen had been so confident in her authority that she'd never bothered to verify that she actually had the legal right to do what she was threatening. Her assumption that I would be intimidated by her harassment had been a costly mistake. More importantly, the experience had shown me that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the consequences of their own actions. I hadn't set out to turn Karen's shed into a public restroom, but her own behavior had created the circumstances that made it possible. She'd been so focused on controlling what I did with my property that she'd never considered what might happen to her own property. The nature trail and its facilities had become a valuable addition to the community, providing recreational opportunities and environmental education that benefited everyone in the area. Even Karen, despite her initial resistance, had eventually come to appreciate having easy access to the wetlands area. I'd seen her walking on the trail early in the morning, though she always pretended not to notice me when our paths crossed. The whole experience had also taught me to be more careful about understanding the rules and regulations that govern where I live. I'd learned to read the fine print, verify legal claims, and do my own research rather than accepting other people's interpretations of complex legal documents. These skills had served me well in other areas of my life, and I'd even been able to help other neighbors understand their rights and responsibilities. Looking back, I realized that Karen's harassment campaign had actually done me a favor. If she hadn't tried to force me to tear down my shed, I never would have discovered that my property was outside the HOA boundaries. I would have continued paying fees for services I wasn't legally obligated to receive, and I would have remained subject to rules that didn't actually apply to me. The $3,000 refund from the HOA had more than covered my legal expenses, and the knowledge I'd gained about property rights and zoning regulations had been invaluable. I'd also developed a much better understanding of how local government works and how citizens can participate in planning processes that affect their communities. Most importantly, the experience had shown me that it's possible to stand up to bullies without becoming a bully yourself. I'd defended my rights without trying to harm Karen personally, and I'd found a way to turn her harassment into something positive for the community. The nature trail and restroom facility were genuinely beneficial public projects that served important conservation and recreational goals. As I watch another group of hikers emerge from the restroom facility and head off down the trail, I feel a sense of satisfaction that goes beyond simple revenge. Karen had tried to use her position of authority to control my life, but instead, she'd ended up contributing to something that was bigger and more important than either of our personal disputes. The wetlands were being protected, the public was gaining access to natural areas, and the community was benefiting from improved recreational opportunities. The irony is that Karen's shed is probably serving a more important purpose as a public restroom than it ever did as a private storage building. The facility is used by dozens of people every day, contributing to their enjoyment of the natural environment and their understanding of conservation issues. Karen's attempt to preserve her vision of suburban perfection had ended up creating something that was much more valuable to the community as a whole. The story of Karen's shed had become something of a local legend, passed down through neighborhood conversations and community meetings. New residents were often told about the HOA president who tried to force a neighbor to tear down his shed and had ended up losing her own shed to a public restroom project. The story served as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the rules before trying to enforce them on other people. For me, the experience had been transformative in ways I hadn't expected. I'd moved to Willowbrook Estates hoping for a quiet suburban life, but I'd ended up learning important lessons about community involvement, environmental conservation, and the power of standing up for what's right. The nature trail had become one of my favorite places to walk and think, and the restroom facility served as a daily reminder that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. The shed in my backyard continued to serve its original purpose, providing storage for my tools and equipment, while also serving as a workshop where I could pursue my woodworking hobby. The experience with Karen had taught me to appreciate the value of being able to work with my hands and create something useful and beautiful. The shed had become more than just a storage building. It had become a symbol of my independence and my refusal to be intimidated by people who tried to control my life. As the sun sets over the wetlands, casting long shadows across the nature trail and the facility that used to be Karen's shed, I can't help but smile at the way things had worked out. Karen's campaign of harassment had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. and her shed had ended up serving the public good in a way she never could have imagined. The whole experience had taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the consequences of their own actions, and that standing up to bullies can lead to outcomes that benefit everyone in the community. The nature trail and its facilities had become a permanent part of the neighborhood's character, and Karen's shed would continue serving hikers and nature enthusiasts for years to come. Every time someone used the facility, they were benefiting from Karen's unwitting contribution to environmental conservation and public recreation. The composting toilet system was working perfectly. The educational displays were attracting school groups from across the county, and the facility had even won an award from the State Environmental Agency for innovative public infrastructure design. The award ceremony was particularly satisfying to witness. The County Parks Department had invited all the stakeholders to attend the presentation, including the property owners who had contributed to the project's success. Karen was specifically mentioned in the presentation as an example of how private citizens could work with government agencies to create innovative solutions for public needs. Karen's acceptance of the recognition was one of the most uncomfortable moments I'd ever witnessed. She stood on the small stage in the community center, holding a plaque that thanked her for her generous contribution to environmental education and public access, while her smile looked like it was carved from Bach stone. The county commissioner who presented the award praised her civic-mindedness and mentioned that her willingness to allow the BCS conversion of her private building for public use demonstrated the kind of community spirit that made conservation projects successful. The local newspaper photographer captured the moment perfectly, with Karen holding the award while standing next to a large poster showing before and after photos of her shed. The before photo showed her pristine beige storage building surrounded by her manicured landscaping, while the after photo showed the attractive earth-toned restroom facility surrounded by native plantings and educational displays. The contrast was striking, and the caption read, "Local resident contributes private building to support wetlands conservation." The article that accompanied the photo was even better than I'd hoped. It described Karen as a forward-thinking community leader who had recognized the importance of balancing private property rights with environmental stewardship. The article quoted her as saying that she was proud to contribute to a project that serves both conservation and recreation goals, though anyone who knew Karen could tell that she was reading from prepared remarks. Through gritted teeth, the recognition brought Karen a level of attention that she clearly hadn't expected. Environmental groups began contacting her about speaking at their events, and she was invited to serve on a county committee that was planning additional conservation projects. The irony was that Karen's reputation as an environmental advocate was growing just as her influence within the neighborhood was declining. The HOA elections that fall were particularly interesting to watch. Karen had been president for 6 years, running unopposed in most elections, because no one else wanted to deal with the responsibilities of managing community affairs. But her handling of the shed controversy had damaged her reputation among many residents, and several people had expressed interest in running for the position. The campaign was remarkably civil, with most candidates focusing on practical issues like snow removal, landscaping maintenance, and social activities, rather than the architectural standards that had been Karen's obsession. Karen's platform emphasized her experience and her commitment to maintaining property values, but she seemed to be fighting a defensive campaign rather than promoting a positive vision for the community's future. The election results were closer than anyone had expected. Karen retained her position as president, but by a much smaller margin than in previous years. More importantly, 2 of the 3 Architectural Review Committee positions went to candidates who had campaigned on platforms of reducing bureaucratic restrictions and focusing on practical community needs, rather than aesthetic regulations. The new committee's first official action was to revise the architectural standards to make them more reasonable and less restrictive. The revised standards eliminated many of the most arbitrary requirements and streamlined the approval process for common home improvements. The committee also established a policy of working with homeowners to find solutions, rather than simply rejecting proposals that didn't meet technical requirements. Karen's reaction to the committee changes was predictably negative. She argued that the revised standards would lead to a decline in property values, and that the community's prestigious reputation would be damaged by allowing too much architectural diversity. But her arguments fell on deaf ears, as most residents were relieved to have more reasonable regulations that still maintained appropriate standards for the neighborhood. The spring following the election brought new energy to the community. Several homeowners took advantage of the revised standards to make improvements that had been previously prohibited, including pergolas, garden sheds, and decorative fencing. The changes were modest and tasteful, but they reflected the personalities and preferences of individual homeowners in ways that had been impossible under Karen's rigid aesthetic regime. My own experience with the new Architectural Review Committee was remarkably positive. I'd been planning to build a small deck off my kitchen, and the approval process took less than 2 weeks from application to approval. The committee members were helpful and professional, offering suggestions for improving the design while respecting my vision for the project. The contrast with Karen's approach was striking. The deck project gave me another opportunity to work with my hands and create something useful for my home. The construction process was relaxing and therapeutic, reminding me of the satisfaction I'd felt when building my original shed. This time, however, I didn't have to worry about harassment or bureaucratic interference. I could focus entirely on the craftsmanship and take pride in creating something that would enhance my enjoyment of my home. The completed deck became one of my favorite spaces, providing a perfect spot for morning coffee and evening relaxation. From the deck, I had a clear view of the nature trail and the restroom facility, which continued to serve a steady stream of visitors throughout the hiking season. The facility had become such a normal part of the neighborhood landscape that new residents often assumed it had always been there. Karen's behavior had gradually evolved from active hostility to resigned acceptance of the situation. She still maintained her perfect yard and continued to enforce HOA regulations with characteristic attention to detail, but her influence had been significantly reduced by the election results and the revised architectural standards. She seemed to have learned that her previous approach had been counterproductive and was trying to rebuild her reputation through less controversial community activities. The nature trail expansion project that had been announced the previous year was finally beginning to take shape. The county had received federal funding for the project, and construction crews were working to connect the existing trail to a larger network of hiking paths that would span several counties. The restroom facility would serve as a major stopping point on the expanded trail system, with improved parking and additional educational displays. The expansion project brought new attention to the neighborhood, with hiking magazines and environmental websites featuring articles about the innovative trail system and its facilities. The restroom facility was specifically mentioned in several articles as an example of how creative partnerships between government agencies and private citizens could create effective solutions for public needs. Karen's role in the project continued to be portrayed in positive terms, though anyone who knew the real story could appreciate the irony of the situation. She'd become an unwitting poster child for environmental cooperation, and her shed had become a symbol of successful public-private partnerships. The recognition was genuine and well-deserved from the perspective of the final outcome, even if her motivations hadn't been entirely altruistic. The second anniversary of the restroom facility's opening was marked by a small celebration organized by the County Parks Department. The event included guided nature walks, educational presentations about wetlands conservation, and a picnic lunch for volunteers and supporters of the trail system. Karen attended the event, looking uncomfortable but maintaining her public persona as a supporter of environmental causes. The celebration gave me an opportunity to reflect on how much had changed since Karen had first threatened to tear down my shed. The neighborhood had become more relaxed and friendly, with residents feeling more comfortable expressing their individual preferences within reasonable community standards. The nature trail had become a valuable amenity that enhanced property values and quality of life for everyone in the area. Most importantly, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for what's right and finding creative solutions to difficult problems. Karen's attempt to control my life had ultimately led to positive changes that benefited the entire community. Her harassment campaign had backfired in ways that she never could have imagined, and her shed had ended up serving a much more important purpose than she'd ever intended. As I stood in my backyard that evening, watching the last hikers of the day emerge from the restroom facility and head back to their cars, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how everything had worked out. Karen's shed had become a symbol of community cooperation and environmental stewardship, serving hundreds of people every month and contributing to important conservation goals. The experience had also taught me to appreciate the value of persistence and careful research when dealing with bureaucratic challenges. Karen's confidence in her authority had been based on incomplete information and assumptions that she'd never bothered to verify. Her failure to understand the legal complexities of property boundaries and zoning regulations had been the foundation of her downfall. The story of Karen's shed had become part of the neighborhood's oral history, passed down through community gatherings and casual conversations. New residents were often told about the HOA president who'd tried to force a neighbor to tear down his shed and had ended up losing her own shed to a public restroom project. The story served as both entertainment and education, reminding people of the importance of understanding the rules before trying to enforce them on others. For Karen, the experience had been a harsh lesson in the consequences of overreach and the importance of building consensus rather than relying on authority alone. Her reputation in the neighborhood had been permanently changed by her handling of the shed controversy, and she'd learned that her previous approach to community leadership was no longer effective or acceptable to most residents. The restroom facility continued to operate successfully, serving as a model for other communities that were developing similar trail systems. The county had received inquiries from park departments across the state about the innovative approach to facility development, and Karen's shed had become an unlikely example of creative problem-solving in Barack. Public infrastructure. As winter approached and the nature trail prepared for another season of reduced activity, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony of the situation one more time. Karen's determination to control the aesthetic character of the neighborhood had led to the creation of a public facility that served thousands of people every year. Her attempt to preserve her vision of suburban perfection had resulted in something that was much more valuable and meaningful than anything she'd originally intended. The shed in my backyard continued to serve its original purpose, providing storage and workshop space, while also serving as a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. Every time I worked on a project in my shop, I thought about the lessons I'd learned from dealing with Karen's harassment campaign. The experience had made me a more confident and effective advocate for my own rights and interests. The whole experience had also deepened my appreciation for the natural environment and the importance of conservation efforts. The wetlands area that the nature trail provided access to had become one of my favorite places to walk and observe wildlife. The educational displays at the restroom facility had taught me about the complex ecosystem relationships that made the wetlands such an important environmental resource. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Karen's harassment campaign had actually been a gift, though she'd never intended it that way. Her attempt to force me to tear down my shed had led to discoveries about property rights, zoning regulations, and community governance that had been valuable in many areas of my life. The knowledge I gained and the confidence I'd developed had served me well in other challenging situations. The nature trail and its facilities had become a permanent part of the community's identity, and Karen's shed would continue serving hikers and nature enthusiasts for decades to come. Every person who used the facility was benefiting from Karen's unwitting contribution to environmental conservation and public recreation. The composting toilet system was working perfectly. The educational displays were attracting school groups from across the region, and the facility had become an integral part of the expanded trail network. As I looked out at the facility one final time before heading inside for the evening, I couldn't help but smile at the way things had worked out. Karen's campaign of harassment had backfired in the most spectacular way possible, and her shed had ended up serving the public good in a way she never could have imagined. The whole experience had taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the consequences of their own actions, and that standing up to bullies can lead to outcomes that benefit everyone in the community. The restroom facility stood as a monument to the power of persistence, the importance of understanding the rules before trying to enforce them, and the value of finding creative solutions to difficult problems. Karen's shed had become much more than just a public restroom. It had become a symbol of how individual conflicts can sometimes lead to positive changes that benefit entire communities. And every time someone used the facility, they were participating in Karen's unwitting contribution to environmental conservation and public recreation, a legacy that would endure long after the original Bass. Conflict had been forgotten.